Hey, what's up? Welcome to my little series on Intro to Maya. Here's a basic output of what I'm going to make over this tutorial. Now, this tutorial is not so much focused on the specifics of how to make a certain thing. And a lot of them are fantastic. I highly recommend you check those out. But a lot of my students, when they're completely new, first time, I think would really appreciate just a basic tutorial on how Maya works. How do you just navigate with the basics? How do you, move around in your scene and make objects, simple objects, and add materials and set up a light and render. I know a lot of beginners jump into Maya, and essentially the first thing you want to do when you're learning any 3D program is, how to make cool stuff, right? You want to get in and make your favorite weapon from a game, or maybe you want to just make some object or start sort of building, architectural scenes or whatnot. The thing is that can get really distracting really quickly because all you're doing is focusing on learning modeling, and at no stage through that learning process do you ever actually make just a simple, nice, pretty render that you can be happy with. So this tutorial series is just going to go through this exact scene. This is what we'll be making. It's pretty straightforward, but I'm assuming that you've never used Maya before, so I'll be going over at a fair bit of length, just as thoroughly and carefully as possible, what all the tools are and why you do certain things and why you need to think about things in a certain way. And so we'll go through and model all of the objects we see. I'll then, of course, set up a little render scene. So I'm using Redshift to render. Redshift is a free download, but it will be watermarked unless you have the license. It'll look exactly like this, only it'll have Redshift watermark across it. It's such a beautiful renderer. It's so fast and it's very powerful. So I love it, and I'll definitely recommend it. Anyone interested in finding a nice renderer to look into Redshift. So that's what we're using for this. You can definitely follow along if you have Maya and you have at least the free version of Redshift. Basically, we're just going to focus on absolute fundamentals. Once you can do this, you should be able to then take your modeling a lot further and start building up interesting looking objects, apply materials to them, set up your lights, camera, and render. So we won't be unwrapping. As you can see, there's no textures in here. There's no animation. Nothing's moving. We're not doing anything overly sophisticated. We're simply learning the basics from a complete starting point to get you up and running as quickly as possible in order to make a pretty image. So I hope that's useful, and I hope that you can follow along and come away feeling a lot more confident in the basics of Maya, and then that should set a really solid foundation for becoming an expert in 3D. So good luck. Thanks for watching. So this is Maya 2018. It doesn't really matter too much what version you're using. This is a very, very much an introductory level tutorial, so it's no prior knowledge assumed. Getting you up to speed as quickly as possible with basic navigation, very fundamental modeling, adding some lights, doing a render. Now this basic layout is, you can customize these. There are a bunch of presets up here. I typically just stay in Maya Classic and just customize this as I want. Over on the left here, we've got down in these buttons are our viewport customization. So this is called our viewport here. And I can click, so this particular button, little picture of what looks like some sort of outliner, is called the outliner. So it's a bunch of settings, what's in our scene. So if I were to add something to our new scene, I'll get to the shelf in a second, but if I have something, I've just created a cube, and you can see here it's showing me the cube. For now, I'm not going to worry about this, though. I just want maximum screen space and to get the hang of what I'm looking at. I can click on these different buttons here, and it's going to give me like dual screens. I can get four windows or just the one. So these are a nice, quick, easy way to select my viewports. A lot of people like to just tap spacebar. So one click on the spacebar, and I've got all four views. And then if I move my cursor into the view I want, so say I want to look at the top view, with my cursor anywhere in the top viewport, if I tap spacebar again, it goes to full screen. So it's really quick this way to tap spacebar, let's say the side, tap spacebar, etc. Personally, I like to stay in full screen, and there are times when it's just quick and easy to change viewports. You might want to change to something that isn't already selected. Perhaps one of these viewports aren't what you want. You may want to be going to a camera on one and a perspective on the other. So, for example, these two windows, I can click these two windows here, two viewports, and I don't care what they are. This one's perspective, this one's front at the moment, but let's say I want to see the perspective here and I want the top over here. The way you can change an existing viewport to any viewport that you want is just hold down space and hold down your mouse bar, so the left mouse button, and then select which view you want. So anywhere you hold down space, the word Maya appears directly underneath your cursor. So I'm just going to hold down and say maybe I want the right view, or I want the front view, top view. If there's a camera in my scene, I can look through that. So that's quite useful. And if I want to come back to a single screen, just click that big single screen button. So that's nice and easy. If you want to have something in your scene like I'm looking at the moment, I'm using the shelf. So this is basically a bunch of shortcuts to things that are hidden away in the menus and stuff that you're going to use fairly regularly. So with poly modeling, you're going to be making cubes all the time. So let's just click in the shelf here. I can choose different versions. We're not going to worry about curves and surfaces for this tutorial, so this is a different type of modeling. For now, let's just look at polygons, and I'm going to make a cube just so that's easy for me to look at something. You definitely want something in your scene for this. And you need to be able to absolutely master orbiting around your object, panning. So this is called panning, where I can go from side to side or up or down and adjust it, and also zooming. And with zooming, we don't want to just use the scroll wheel. So I can zoom by scrolling my scroll wheel, and that's okay, but when you get in close and precise, you'll notice that it's jumping. What's much nicer is if I can smoothly zoom in and out. And I use a mix. Usually when I'm out, I'll do a quick scroll wheel adjustment. If I want to get in close and precise, I'll use this way. And so the way these functions work, orbit, pan, and zoom, is simply holding down the Alt key. So all of these is Alt. Hold down Alt, and Alt with your left mouse gives you orbiting. So you can orbit around your 3D object. Alt with the middle mouse, which is clicking and holding the scroll wheel button. Most mice these days have a scroll wheel. That's what we refer to when we're talking about middle mouse button. So clicking and holding the scroll wheel middle mouse button for our pan, and then zooming in is Alt and right mouse. So Alt left mouse, Alt middle mouse, Alt right mouse. Now what can happen quite a lot is this sort of thing where you're not focused on the object. So if you're not looking at what you want to look at, just hit F on the keyboard, F for focus, and you're zoomed straight in. Now that works on any level. So at the moment what we're looking at is an object in our scene, and this is called object level. But objects are made up of other components. And what I want to do now is just quickly talk about sub-objects. So if I hold down my right mouse, it gives me, you can see object mode, which is what we're currently in. You know you're in object mode when it's green. If I hold down the right mouse and go to face, I'm now in a sub-object mode called face. So it's the different components that make up this whole object. So in face mode, it lets me select these main faces. I'll hold down my right mouse and go to edge mode. It lets me select these edges. Hold down my right mouse and go to vertex, and that's the points in 3D space. So we have our vertices, or vertex, single vertex, multiple vertices, connected by an edge. And then for, in this case, it's what's called a quad. This polygon is four-sided, so it's a quad. Makes up a face. Four edges give us the face. And the reason I wanted to jump straight to explaining sub-object mode is, firstly, if you accidentally find yourself in this mode where they're blue, or you're selecting things that you want and you don't intend to be here, right click, hold down the right mouse and go to object mode. That's you. Anytime you're in sub-object, you need to go back to object mode in order to get out of it. You can't do anything else until you're out. Now, before I was talking about focus, so we're out of shot, I hit F to focus on my object, when you're modeling, you'll be working on these vertices and edges. And again, if I'm trying to work on something that's way over here, it can be tricky. If I could just hit F, it's going to focus on whatever I've selected. So at the moment I'm focusing on my my vertex here. So what you don't want to do is say I'm working on this thing over here and I decide I need to look at it from the opposite direction, and I sit there and struggle orbiting around. So this comes back to what I said about you need to master being able to orbit. Well, I need to know right now my viewport is not focused on what I want it to be focused on. So I'm going to hit F, and now again I'm looking at what I need to be looking at. So get very comfortable selecting what you want, focusing on it by hitting F, and then being able to move around and manipulate it. Now you noticed I've made some changes to this object. I've moved it. What I'm doing here is using these, this is the select tool, I'm using these tools that let me adjust my model in 3D space. So I was doing this at a sub-object level where I was selecting vertices and moving those, but even just at the main object level, I can click on this one, which is the move tool, and our shortcut for this is W. Move will let us move it up and down, or if I click in the center there, in any direction, undo that. So I can click on a single axis and move it exactly precisely where I want, in X, Y, or Z. Or I can click in the middle and move everywhere. I strongly advise against clicking in the middle for move, because you don't know what you're doing. This is going in a random direction and it's not quite where I think it is. And down here you can end up upside down. It's going to get confusing. You need to get in the habit of being precise when you're using a 3D app. So for move, you want to always just use a specific axis. The next one down is rotate, and if we hover over that, it'll tell us that E is our rotate tool. And so again, we want to just click on the individual axes if we want to rotate these in a specific direction. If we click in the center, it's going to rotate in all directions at once, and that's pretty much never what you want. And finally, scale. I might actually just delete that and make a new cube that's not messed up. Scale is a little bit different to the others I said, because if you move in just the one axis, it's stretching in just that direction, which sometimes is exactly what you want. You know, I may want to make like some sort of pillar, but what you often want to do with scale is all directions at once. And with sub-object mode, so again, I hold my right mouse and I can click the vertex. I can likewise, instead of manipulating the entire object, I can come in and say I actually just want to move that edge, or I just want to move this face. The next thing we should really talk about is the channel box. So I'm making these changes to my object, but my only way of really knowing what I'm doing is by eyeballing it. This icon up here will open up the channel box, which is this tab, and you can see usually you'll have all your tabs selected on the right here. This is definitely the nicest format. So you can see this will jump through my modeling toolkit, which is shortcuts to modeling, we'll get to in a minute. My attribute editor, we'll look at this when we set up some lights to render. We're not going to use the human IK system. And tool settings. This is useful basically if you have any issues with a tool. The most useful thing is to select your tool settings, little picture of the hammer, and come in and just reset the tool, just in case there's any issues. Let's not get into what that does so far right now, but looking at the channel box, this shows me a number of values for this object. So notice when I go into the move tool and drag it up, my translate Y is changing. Or if I drag it in the blue, which is Z, my translate Z is changing. If I want to zero this out, snap it back to the world origins, I can just click in here and hit 0, turn on my number pad, hit 0, and tab 0, and I'm back to the center of the world. Or I can click on the first one. If I want to zero all of these out, hold down Shift and then click on the final value that I want to change and hit 0, and they'll all change. Of course, we don't want to scale it to 0, but maybe we want to scale it to 1. Now with our move, rotate and scale, and select, instead of coming over here and clicking, you'll notice I haven't been moving my cursor over here because it's far quicker just to use the keyboard shortcuts that this tells you is W, E, and R. And then Q again gets out of it, just takes you back to the select tool. Hitting Q to get out and being back to your select tool is a habit that you should be in for everything you do. Just constantly stop using whatever tool you're using and get back to no tool. Even just if you're in the move tool, it's especially if you have multiple things in your scene, so you may have a couple of objects, you don't want to be clicking on things and accidentally, whoops, I moved it, without even realizing. It's easy to make mistakes. You want to, again, always be precise and do everything intentionally when you're working in 3D. And the best way to avoid little mistakes is just hit Q when you're finished so that you're not accidentally moving things or making changes to your objects unintentionally. One thing you'll notice that I just did was I duplicated my object. That's a really common thing you'll want to do in 3D is make multiple copies of an object. If you just come into the edit menu, it's duplicate, and the shortcut is Control-D, D for duplicate, just in case you're wondering how I did that. There are other tools to duplicate. Duplicate special basically will let me make multiple duplications, and I can specify the exact distance apart and so forth, but for now, just the basics there if we need to start making changes. So what I'm going to do now is, that was a quick rundown of the basics of how to navigate, how to orbit around and select things. But what we want to do now is just a little bit of modeling. And probably the first thing I'll do, I'm going to start with a plane. And the reason I've picked a plane is that I want to set up a little stage which we can put some lights on and render a few objects. Now, I'm going to hit F to focus in on my object and decide actually, no, that's really small. If I were to go into the settings, we would see that a single cube is in the grid is 1 centimeter. And I'll just point out at this stage, I should have said this at the start, my interface is slightly customized, so it'll look a little different to yours most likely, so don't worry about that and trying to make it look the same. That's just how I like to operate with this. With this object, I'm just going to scale it up a bit. This button in the viewport, it's a picture of a grid. If I hover over, it says grid. Click that, we get rid of the grid. What I wanted to show here was all of these subdivisions are not something I want. I only want a single plane. Generally, anytime you're working with 3D, with a model, you want to keep it as low polygon as possible. Have as few faces as you can get away with. That rule changes when you're subdividing. If you want to smooth your model so that it looks nice, you'll do that later. But while you're working on it, you keep it nice and low poly so that you can then easily manipulate your model before you go and subdivide and smooth it, and it ends up looking quite beautiful. If you try to work with something that's high, a little bit too dense and high, too many divisions like this, it makes the work a lot slower and more difficult. And the way you can change these objects, and you only want to do this when you first create them. So when I first make a plane, if I scale it up, before I go into sub-object mode and start doing anything to the plane itself, that's the time to change it, and you go into the channel box to do this, and where it says inputs, you can click on the model, and here you can say 1 by 1, for example, and customize it to be exactly how you want. So I'm just going to make a simple little stage. I'll go into edge mode, holding down the right mouse, edge, select an edge, and what I want to do here is some basic modeling, very basic modeling. I come into the modeling toolkit, You can see a number of shortcuts to functions that exist in the Edit Mesh and Mesh Tools system. So what we're going to be using right at the moment is the extrude command, or Control E is a shortcut, where you can simply click the extrude button. Now be aware you need to have the sub-object that you want to perform this operation on selected before you do it. You have to tell Maya what you want to do. If I have nothing selected and I hit extrude, it doesn't know what I want to do. I have to say, I actually just want to extrude this edge. Now I'm going to extrude the edge. And what that does is create new geometry. So this face didn't exist before. Now, when you start extruding, it's easy to run into trouble, and I'll demonstrate what that is. If I click extrude, right now that has created new geometry, but it hasn't moved it. It's directly on top. If I move it, you can see it's under there. But what can happen a lot is, let's say, for example, I just hit Control Z, but that extrude still exists. If I move it again, it's still there. Control Z, again, the extrude is still there. It hasn't gone away. So what, Control Z, what a lot of people do is accidentally, when they're starting out, they accidentally hit extrude, they realize maybe they've made a mistake, maybe they've gone forward a few steps and then they've Control Z a bunch of times to undo, only they haven't undone far enough. And this can be a problem because you can then start extruding new geometry, not realizing that there's actually multiple faces, and you end up with these messy kind of bits and pieces of geometry. Now, if you've accidentally done that, I mean, once you're more familiar with Maya, you'll learn really quickly how to avoid those sorts of issues of accidentally extruding. But when you're learning, you need a way of quickly checking if there's a bit of problem in your geometry. So I'm just going to undo. What I recommend doing is turning on the details, the polygon count of your model. So if I come into display, head up display, polygon count, this shows me all of the stats for verts, edges, faces, tris and UVs in my scene. First column is everything in the entire scene. Second column is everything for those stats on the object I currently have selected. And the final one is the number for those stats that is currently selected in that sub-object. So for example, at the moment I've got a single edge selected, so it's saying there's one edge. When I go to vertex mode, I drag select on that corner, I should actually see one, but I'm seeing two vertices there. So I drag select and it's showing me one, so these vertices are correct, but this one is a problem, because when I drag select it's showing me two. Now notice I'm not just clicking on it. If I just click on it, what I've done is just selected the first thing that Maya has detected with that single click, which means I've not selected both of those vertices. So to do this, you don't want to just click on a model, you want to make a small drag selection over what should be a single vertice. And just a quick look up here will let you know if it's one or two. So when I have two, instead of having to undo this, I can just merge these together. And so the way I do that is drag select, merge, selecting my two verts. Now at this point it's worth quickly checking that you have actually selected what you want. So I'm just hitting F on the keyboard, zooming out a touch, and I can see I haven't accidentally selected other things. So what I mean by that is, let's say you didn't notice that you've also selected this one. If I hit F and I zoom in, it's showing me I've actually got two verts. It's very clear when you're this close that there's two verts selected, but maybe you were, over here somewhere and you've accidentally selected, you think you've got one vert selected, but you don't know, you're just too far away, you're not at a correct angle to be able to see what you're doing. And so this is what I mean by getting back to being precise and constantly orbiting around, mastering being able to orbit around and focusing in on exactly what you want. So I select what I think is one vert, I hit F to focus and go, whoops, no, that's clearly two verts. I didn't want this one. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and notice my cursor, when it hovers over that, turns into a negative. So I'm holding down Shift, and when I click on that, it deselects it. If I hit F now, I'm only seeing a single vert. If I'm too close like that, it's the clipping. You can fix that, but we're not going to worry. So back to my point, I drag select that and we've got two vertices and I want to collapse those. So I'm just going to go into Edit Mesh, Merge to Center, and that will merge whatever I currently have selected to the center. In other words, if I have two vertices and they're slightly far apart, it will find the average distance between those two vertices and merge them into the center. Because they're on top of each other, when I click that, it just turns it into one vertice and it's in the same spot. So I do the same here. Now I don't have to go into that menu again. That menu was under Edit Mesh, Merge to Center, but I don't need to do that because Maya is, you're constantly repeating the last command that you did. And so the keyboard shortcut to repeat that last command is hit G. So I hit G and it merges to center. So if I had a whole bunch, I could just go around and hit G, hit G, hit G, and that would quickly clean it up. So while that was a bit of a long-winded explanation for how to clean up your geometry, the process is extremely quick, but you need to understand why you're trying to do that. So I'm just going to continue on just making this little stage. Going to select this edge and I'll start with this edge. I want to drag this up a little bit. I'm just trying to make like a little ramp. What I could do is go to the front view. In this case, the back view is the angle I was looking at before. So I'm looking at a single edge there. If I now go to vertex mode and quickly drag, that selects both of those vertices. So I've just selected essentially the equivalent to selecting this edge. So by looking at it from the side here, go to vertex mode and drag select, I can grab that whole edge. That's just one way of quickly doing that. So I'm going to edge mode and I'm going to extrude that again. Hitting W because I want to move that. Hitting G because I want to repeat the extrude. And let's hit W and get that one more time. That's fine. Object mode, so right mouse, hold down right mouse object. And that gives us a little ramp. If you get faceting like this, it's just because the edge of your model is set to a hard edge. If you just go into Mesh Display, Soften Edge, it gives it this nice continuous smooth gradient. It's much nicer. So what I'm going to do now, I haven't saved the scene. At this stage, let's save. So File, Save Scene As, and pick a sensible location.